radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network.
Good evening, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Today is Thursday, July 20th, 2023. This is Fade to Black. Now, we've got a great show tonight, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Tonight, we have Phillip Bernhardt-House with us. We're going to be talking about Celtic Dogheads and werewolves and much more. We'll get to all of that. I want to remind everybody to help support our show. I want to thank everybody that has ordered their T-shirts and have gotten their Game Changer memberships. You can do all of that on the links below. Everything ships for free, ships the next day. You get your tracking numbers, you get all of that. But we've got a big team here, and help support all of the work that we do, because we do broadcast 2 shows a day, 4 days a week. We do the news in the afternoon. We do Fade to Black at night. Today I did 3 shows. I did one with Christina Gomez. I did 3 shows yesterday. It's just what we do. So just help us and support our work by getting your Fade to Black T-shirts. All right, everything ships for everything is autographed. Everything is right there. And I want to mention that next Wednesday, July 26th, is the House Oversight Committee's UFO hearing. And today, Christina and I did a show about that. And we're going to be broadcasting live next week with the hearing live. We will have our commentary there live during the show. Of course, the chat's going to be open, and I can only imagine what that is going to be like. And leading up to all of that, I watched Tim Burchett's press conference that he did with his team. And I did a quick tweet. I don't tweet or get my personal comments into social media that often, but I had to today. That press conference, if you haven't watched it, head over to my Twitter and click on that and watch that press conference and listen to what is said. Christina and I were speculating today about what this hearing is going to be like. And whew, man, watch that press conference. That just watch it. If there is any question about what their agenda is about UFOs and ET contact and hiding stuff from the public, if that's exactly what this is about, and if there's any questions in your mind about how Tim Burchett is going to be handling this, go and watch that press conference. It's going to be an historic day for sure. Tonight we have Phillip Bernhardt-House with us. And he researches the theories of Celtic studies, medieval literature, world religions, and the academic study of magic. Now, I am totally going to trash his spiritual name. It is P. Sufenas Virius Lupus, I believe. He also has written extensively on ancient and modern polytheism, my favorite subject, in theory, theology, and practice. And I would like to welcome, I just got the thumbs up, by the way. I'd like to welcome for the first time to Fade to Black, Phillip Bernhardt-House, doctor, by the way. Welcome. How you doing?
Thank you very much. This is amazing. I'm not sure that I'm cool enough to be on this show, but I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, and we were talking. Before we get started, you get the first time guest disclaimer. So let's get that out of the way. Which is this, Philip? It's just you and I sitting on my couch, having a conversation as friends. Where that conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends, it ends. But we're going to end as friends. So you have to accept. Accept.
I absolutely accept, unreservedly,
Okay.
enthusiastically.
Yeah, you didn't read the fine print in the customer agreement, but nonetheless, the your bio. We were talking about this earlier, and I didn't read the entire thing, but it's funny, it's direct, and there's a lot of historical reference there in the bio. I didn't want to go through the whole thing, but I got to tell you, man, you've got an open mind, and you've got a PhD. But you've got a very, very cool way of looking at the world, which gives me the easiest opening question ever. Why? What got you into this? I mean, we're going to be talking about some crazy fun stuff tonight. I'm going to learn a lot. But did you have a crazy uncle? Did you have some what happened?
Yeah, I would say it started before the crazy uncle, but yeah, I have just been a how would you put it nicely? Let's not put it nicely. Just a weird little kid
Mm-hmm.
forever. Um, my mom talked about me saying, highly mature things when I was a 2-year-old. Um, I also talked before I walked. I was a very, very late walker, not due to any health difficulties at that point, but just because I was very, very lazy. So I'm one of these people who has, been most comfortable sitting and thinking about stuff, as far back as it goes. And I'm a lifelong insomniac. I remember sitting up and reading books before I could read and scrutinizing them. And, I had more or less memorized them from having been read to me. But, you know, uh, just, I'd say I have a very active mind. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination the smartest person that I know. I know many people who are much, much more, genius level than I am. I think it's good to always have, people who are uh, more intelligent than you in your
You
circle
have
of
to be
friends.
yeah, you have to be challenged. You have to be
Yeah,
challenged.
yeah,
When I was a kid, and I'm saying this because it's actually a question.
right.
But when I was a kid, I didn't understand the appeal of comic books and
Hmm,
stuff like that that my friends all had and read.
right.
I would grab, the Encyclopedia Britannica. I would
Yep.
get a and just read every page. That was and now as an adult, although I still enjoy the nonfiction stuff, it's my focus. But I love comic books now. It's like
Yeah.
this
Yep.
weird flip. Were you the same way? Were you just an academic as a kid, and you needed the nonfiction input?
It is interesting because I probably have bought more comics in my adulthood than in my childhood, just simply because some of the best mythological fiction and stuff like that is coming out in graphic novels, with uh, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, all of these, people that are kind of the classics of comics these days. But yeah, I mean, one of the first books that I checked out at the public library, I can't quite remember the title of it, but it was on witchcraft. And it was a book that was published probably in the late 60s, early 70s. And here I was getting this out, at 6 years old in 1982. after I got my first library card. And yeah, so I mean, a lot of this has been there from the start. I remember very clearly some of the dreams that I had as a 3 and 4 year old that have not made sense to me until, you know, 20 some years later, and finding out more. Um, you know, the 5 years that I lived in Ireland and was working on my PhD and traveled around and did a bunch of stuff. A lot came together in those years beyond just the PhD. So yeah, and the PhD itself. I wouldn't have been doing that if I um, hadn't had what we would have to refer to as not exactly academic reasons and motivations. I had certain experiences with some of the figures I was reading about in Irish mythology, and they basically said, learn as much about us as you can, and if that means going to Ireland and doing a PhD, do it. And so that's what I did. Um,
Wait. Now you got my attention. You already had my attention, but now you got my attention. And you can't say something like that without expanding. So let's
okay,
back up for a second.
sure.
When you say that you were having experiences with the elements that you were about to go and study, what are you trying to say? And but yeah, actually, I what was going on?
So at that point, um, I uh, let's see, where do we pinpoint this? From my sophomore year of high school onward, I kind of look at that as the turning point. In fact, October 31st of, I guess that would have been 1991. That was the real kind of point where my life pivoted. I am a long-term asthmatic and type 1 diabetic,
Mm-hmm.
and multiple times from age 10 to 18, I probably had about 5 or 6 near-death experiences during that period. The kind of most significant one, at least for me, was the October 31st one in 1991. And as a result of that, I got out of one of the classes I was doing that was causing me a lot of stress, which was debate. I had been on the debate team, wasn't very good at it. Did great in the impromptu event, which is just, you have 6 minutes to make up a speech on a topic you're given. Was great at that. Any of the prepared speeches, awful. Um, and so anyway, I had a combination low blood sugar and uh, really bad asthma attack that put me into respiratory arrest on that day. Um, was not a pleasant experience. And when I came to, I was laying in a hospital bed. It being Halloween, all of the nurses were wearing antennas, and things like this. And one of them came up and said, "Oh, you're finally awake." And I thought to myself, are we allowed to curse on this program?
I don't, but
Okay.
you do.
Well,
You do you.
I'll say that I thought something that's an expletive, and then thought I must be in hell because I didn't recognize that I was in a hospital room. And then slowly figured out, okay, yeah, this is you're still alive. Okay, good. Um, And at that point, I entered into an independent study course when I got back to school after that experience, with one of my favorite professors who got me on to studying Joseph Campbell.
Ah,
And so I was going to do creative writing, look at Arthurian literature, and read Joseph Campbell. And, of course, that opened up all kinds of things for me. And it did open up the academic area of, hey, there's this whole thing called Celtic Studies. It crosses over with Arthurian studies, etc., which kind of put me on the main academic track that I then pursued. You can't really do much with it in high school in most places, but I certainly did in college. And then it also kind of made me realize that a lot of the experiences I had as a child, um, and up to that point, wasn't really consonant with the Catholicism that I had mostly been raised with. It was, uh, definitely something more along the lines of polytheism.
right, right,
And so,
right.
yeah, so I count that from the age of 16 on, I've been a polytheist, which
I
is
literally, I'm going to jump. I literally nearly said the exact same words last night in my AMA about my turning point.
mm,
And all the same, dude, all the same Catholic spirituality, polytheism, it's just all the way down the line. And
yeah.
it was a crazy turning point for me. And again, this is not a statement about me, it's a question directed at you. But for me, when I went through that, my memory is I spent 2 weeks in my bedroom, wouldn't
Mm,
come out. I think it was more like 7 days, but it was definitely emotional. It was a crazy thing, and it wasn't about the Catholic side or the religious side. It was more that about I've been living a lie. Like the world has been lying to me. It's not what I thought that it was. Is that what happened to you?
in a certain sense, yes. One of the things that I noticed was an immediate effect of this whole kind of reorientation of my approach, you could say, is I was very much fighting to be, the top academic, being that I was, chronically ill. I couldn't really do sports and all of that kind of thing. And in the small town I grew up in, which is incidentally where I live now, uh, sports is the thing. Academics isn't really respected in the same way. And so I knew that if I was going to get scholarships, I needed to do really well and all of that kind of thing. And it was a struggle. I mean, I was certainly excelled in my classes and so forth, but it was still a struggle. And at that point, I went, I multiple times could have died. This competitive nonsense is not really helping, and I'm not here for it anymore. And the strange thing about it was that at that point, everything got easier. I didn't actually have to struggle to do well in classes. It seemed like uh, I was on the right track at last, and everything just sort of flowed at that point. And then as far as the religious stuff goes, I just had so many questions that were not getting answered. And that I thought, well, I have my own answers to some of these things, and they're not what the priest is telling me. They're not what Catholic doctrine is telling me. It's not what Christianity is telling me. And but it's actually very, very similar to, stuff that has been around for thousands of years longer than that.
That's right. No,
Um,
you hit the nail on the head. And it's really, when we take a look at, especially where we are today with organized religion, if you back this clock up 5,000 years, 4,000 years, you back this thing up, the ancient cultures back then, and it's not so much, we call it religion today because we don't have the right word for it.
right.
But they had it figured out.
Yeah.
They had it figured out. Paganism, Hermeticism, those forbidden arts and the secret schools, they had consciousness figured out. They had love figured out.
Yeah.
They had the arts figured out. They had music figured out. They had laws figured out. They had it going on.
Yeah.
It's totally bizarre to me, where I can relate to all of the ancient stuff. It makes sense to me as a modern person in 2023. It's absolutely nuts. And for some reason, humanity got amnesia.
Yeah.
I can't figure it out. It was like Isaac Newton might have been like the last cool dude.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it isn't as if there haven't been some people who figured something out within, the overarching system of the religious hegemony that we've lived with for, since the 5th century. But, you're very correct, I think, in saying that a lot of the stuff that we are coming back around to now, often in scientific terms, is stuff that they figured out a long time ago.
Bingo.
And yeah,
Bingo.
and it's the the even the way that history is taught and is talked about and is discussed in the textbooks being used in classrooms and things like that, is very, very biased, in terms of taking, if not Christianity, then at least monotheism as the default and the correct position. And it really is an anomaly in and of itself. They say, oh, well, there's more Christians, there's more Muslims than any other religion in the world. And it's like, well, yes, but if you combine all of the Christians and the Muslims, there's still more people of other religions or no religion in the world population. And, of the thousands of religions that have existed and still exist, and we'll just use religion as the placeholder term because,
There isn't another word. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way that Cicero referred to it, was cultus deorum, right? The cultivation of the gods. They had ideas of, piety. They had ideas of devotion, all of this kind of stuff. But like most indigenous religions, they didn't see it as being separate from culture, right? Which is the big difference that the hegemonic monotheisms have, is that they come in and say, it doesn't matter what culture you are, this is the universal religion, you must believe it, so your culture doesn't matter. Whereas, to this day, you talk to somebody in Japan and you say, do you believe in Shinto? And they're like, what do you mean? It's not something that you believe in. It's just part of the culture.
Right. Yeah, I didn't want to dive too deep into religion, but
Sure.
how to divide my audience right now. Let's do it right down the middle. But it's this. I was always confused I'm talking about 3, 4, 5 years old and on up, right? This whole heaven and hell thing.
Right.
And it didn't, because if I go to heaven, right? I go to heaven, and I think I get my pass card, right? I think I'm good. I've done some bad stuff, but I think overall I'm in. But I don't want to be there forever,
Right?
and not have like forever. Like, isn't this place great? Well, yeah. I'm waiting for my friends to get here. Right. I don't, and I don't want to be 1,000 years into heaven or 500 years ago. Well, I guess my brother didn't make it. Right. I guess my best friend, they're down burning in hell. Well, that part to me was always confusing to me. And it's not the part. And then you go and you take something very basic if you want to get into a monotheistic conversation. Well, Akhenaten and Ra, and that actually makes more sense to me, right? And he kind of had the right idea, so that I don't know. I'm just blown away by how religion has had its foothold, and then science says no, where a scientist is going to be an atheist, which is fine. I don't give a crap about that. But they want to talk to us about extra dimensions, and they want to talk to us about the multiverse, and they want to talk to us about parallel worlds. Well, that's kind of what the Bible was talking about the whole time. It's weird. And so you can't be spiritual but still a black and white pragmatic scientist. I don't get it. It's weird. And they're clashing.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that I notice in the parapsychology community as well, that they love to talk about consciousness. They love to talk about survival of consciousness after death. But then they always talk about consciousness in monotheistic terms, monistic terms. And the fact is, if we have individual consciousness that can survive past death, then we don't clearly fade just into the oneness of consciousness if we're still individual, if we can still be identified and act individually. But then also the other question that raises, to me at least, is if consciousness can exist independent of physical incarnation, then why can't there be deities? Right?
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And again, we don't have the right, we're not smart enough yet. We think we're smart.
Right.
We don't have the right vocabulary to use.
Right.
There's an example where, and it frustrates me when I hear a physicist say, I don't have time for consciousness. Yeah, I deal with chemicals, right? I deal with particles. I deal with matter. I deal with things I can touch and measure, and no. But yet, in the last chapter, in Brian Greene, and I love Brian Greene, and he's a very bright guy, and I can listen to him all day long, and I've got all his books, and in his last chapter of his newest book, this is what he says, Philip. It's like the craziest thing for a physicist to say of his caliber. He says, when it's all done, when particles come apart, there's nothing left. The universe is over 100 trillion years from now. The only thing left is going to be thought. Thinking will continue, and now and he represents it as these clouds of thought. Well, wait a minute. He won't use the word consciousness.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He doesn't want to offend the academic world.
Right.
And you can't use the word consciousness. But yet you are literally putting this in your book. And it was a very, talk about a thinking exercise, right? A moment. Yeah. Okay. I was challenged with that, but he can't use the word consciousness. And scientists are afraid of doing that. They just won't do it.
Right. It does amaze me how some of these orthodoxies, it doesn't matter what field you're in, if you're in history, if you're in science, if you're in literary theory, a number of these things, there's always a fence somewhere that you're not allowed to cross.
You can't do it. You cannot do it. Well, and you chose to cross it. And I'll bet a dime to a dollar, right? And I'm not kidding about this. Those atheist, non-spiritual, chemistry-based physicists and scientists of the world that we need, and I love them all. But you know what? I bet you they're scared of ghosts. Right? I bet you werewolves frighten them. I bet you they wouldn't walk into a haunted house. But yet, I can't talk about consciousness.
Yeah. It does amaze me how some of these things kind of persist despite people's professed beliefs. I mean, that's one of the things that I always get into a discussion about where religion is concerned, because from the Western perspective, and this is all because of the type of monotheism that we're familiar with, religion equals belief. But the fact is, if you believe something that isn't true, in a factual sense, your belief in it is not going to change it. And if you disbelieve in something that is factual, your disbelief in it is not going to make it go away.
And
So
it cements the belief system.
yeah,
That's the other part of it, right? It doesn't change. It strengthens. And it could be correct or incorrect. It doesn't matter. But whatever it is, it gets stronger. I can never talk somebody into believing, and belief always has a religious content to it. I get that. But I can't talk to somebody into the belief of ET or ghost or something. No. The more that you do that and you try to present the facts, you're just cementing their belief system and not believing in it. It's
right.
It's a crazy thing. Now, how did werewolves and the Celtic? Let me back up, because I'm going to ask that same question in just a minute. King Arthur and Joseph Campbell, go together like cereal and milk.
Right.
That doesn't get any better. And did that happen at the same time?
More or less. I said I wanted to do the Arthurian stuff, and then my teacher said to me, well, it might be useful for you to also read this guy Joseph Campbell. And so I started with The Power of Myth, read the book, watched the videos, became very familiar with that, moved on to Transformations of Myth Through Time, and then started getting into the Masks of God and the Mythic Image, and a number of these other things that he did that are some of his major works. Hero with a Thousand Faces, of course, although I have to say I'm a skeptic of Hero with a Thousand Faces. I'm a skeptic on a number of the things that Joseph Campbell kind of came up with in various ways, because I went to Sarah Lawrence College because he taught there. When I got there, I found that he was not well liked, and that kind of deflated me a little bit. I think a lot of it, was probably jealousy because, he had best-selling books and, shows on PBS and so forth, and various other people didn't. But but at the same time, bringing a kind of critical eye to some of his work, it was ultimately the holes in his work that propelled me further into looking at Celtic stuff. He loved to say this Arthurian stuff is just like this Celtic stuff, but then not talk about the Celtic stuff.
Oh,
And
very. What was he? What was he like? I mean, I've researched and read and did everything that you did. Right. I've got the books,
yep.
and one of my favorite things to do is Joseph Campbell audiobooks and fall asleep at night and just let it subconsciously get it. I mean, he seemed to have it all figured out. Right. And talk about somebody that was a game changer, and he was recognized for that. But what was he like as a person? Was he open to conversation?
Well, I wasn't there when he was there, and he had retired several years before he died. He died in 87 or 88.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's
And
right. That's right.
yeah, and so I wasn't there till fall of '94. But
Right.
I did know people who knew him. I worked in the slide library, that was all of the old-fashioned photographic slides of architecture and art and so forth. And they were big fans of him down there. And I said, "Did he come in here often?" And they said, "Well, actually, not as often as you would think because he mostly had his own slides." Um, but from what I understand, he was very, very nice. But it's one of these things where if you look at kind of his biography as it's known, um, he spoke in his interview with Jeffrey Mishlove
Love
toward the
that
end.
interview. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's a great interview,
it
and
is.
uh, it's that furthered this path for me certainly. And then all these years later, I did a few interviews with Dr. Mishlove myself, so that was an interesting closing of the loop. But when he said that I was studying, and he says it very, just you can feel the spleen in his voice. He says, "I was studying philology," and he speaks of it like it's the worst thing in the world. And then he kind of figured out, oh well, I would like to look at comparative mythology, which didn't exactly exist then. The extent that it did exist when he was in school was like Max Muller, and which ultimately proved to be nonsense. Um, and then probably in his early career, he would have encountered the newer version of comparative mythology, which was comparative Indo-European studies, which also arises out of philology. And that has been under a lot of fire in the last 10 years or so, because a huge number of the people who did that, uh, you can tell it's called Indo-European studies now. They had to change the name of it because it used to be Aryan studies, and a
Right.
lot of
Right.
the people
Right.
who did it were out and out Nazis.
Right.
And so this kind of picture of it as something that sort of supports white supremacy is something that you actually have to take seriously if you're going to look at the material that's been produced in that field.
Well, what do you think ultimately? And then we will talk about werewolves tonight,
Yeah.
everybody. I promise. But with Joseph Campbell And I have thought about this so much. It's the chicken or the egg. For him, what came first? Did he develop his methodologies and his theories and his ideas after reading the classics, going all the way back, and then develop, or did he have these ideas first and then do the correlations to the ancient writings and older works? It's like the chicken or the egg. What do you think came first?
I would think, based on what I know, that because he was so fascinated by Native American storytelling from a very young age, from the age of 4, according to his accepted biographies, that he probably started to notice similarities at that point. I do not in any way want to diminish the fact that he was a fantastic mind, that he was absolutely seminal in shaping definitely entertainment since the 1970s.
That's 100%. It's a fact. It's a fact.
Yeah.
There isn't a movie. There isn't a script. There isn't a TV show. There isn't a book written today that doesn't follow a Joseph Campbell formula.
Right.
It's a fact.
Yeah, and the thing about that I'm a skeptic of is that, in fact, when you look at the actual stories, no hero meets 100% all of the points on the schema that he created, that Lord Raglan, theorized before him.
Right.
And the idea of he was a subscriber to a certain extent to the idea of the perennial philosophy, and perennialism kind of says there's these universal great ideas that are shared across all cultures, and the local variations and the local differences are not really important. And it's the local differences that are the interesting bits, at least in my experience. The weird things, the strange things that can't quite be categorized so easily. The way that these archetypal heroes don't meet the archetype in this story or that story or whatever. And this has been a big part of my own methodology, and kind of gets back to your question of how is it that I am as open-minded as I am. If you go in and look at the evidence and try not to impose a theory on it, that's when you really start to find the interesting things. This was one of the critiques of my book that came out based on my dissertation, is that, well, it would have been a little bit better to have some theory in it. And my thought was, it's better to amass a big pile of evidence and say, what can we figure out from the evidence itself, than to say, well, here's our theory, and then we'll ignore all of these examples, right? Because that's what always happens. The unusual, the anomalous, the doesn't quite fit gets cut off and ignored. And from my perspective, you can't ignore it, and you shouldn't ignore it. And that's where you turn up the really interesting stuff, in my own view. So that's I think the difficulty with Joseph Campbell, is that, yeah, he nailed down the formula, and if you follow that formula, that's the guarantee of success for Hollywood.
You're not allowed today. You're not allowed to not follow it.
That's true, and it drives me nuts, because
you can see it play out. You can see it's on autopilot. Not to say that I don't enjoy it.
Yeah,
And
and it can. There's still good new versions of it, but what we always love is when things are not formulaic, right? When it surprises us a little bit, and so there's not as much of that as I would like, but that's what I've found as I've looked closer at some of the same materials that he looked at is the interesting stuff is the weird stuff that doesn't fit on the chart, you know?
yeah, when I'm watching, it's weird when I go to an art house version of science fiction or storytelling, like A24 or
Yeah,
Bloomhouse or something like that,
yeah,
where you can tell, you can see, and it's probably done with intention, where the Joseph Campbell element isn't there. You may not even have a hero. You
right.
may not even have a hero's ending, or you know what I mean. And it's still a great story, right?
Yeah,
There, if the well, of course, the characters and the development of that, but I still enjoy that. There are filmmakers and writers that stay away from that. I don't know if it's from intention or just naturally, being able to tell a good story. Wes Anderson's a great example of that, I
right.
think.
Yeah.
So how did we? Okay, let's get let's get to werewolves. Joseph Campbell. The other day, I was with a friend of mine that we worked together, and I don't want to say his name because everybody knows who he is. But and this guy's all about consciousness. This guy's all about crystals. This guy's got the Indian tapestries hanging in his living room, and he's got smells of patchouli, and he's burning incense, and he's just all into consciousness and things, man. Chakras and all that, right? And so this is 4 days ago. This just happened, and I've known this guy for a long time. We're tight. I said, well, yeah, it kind of reminds me of Joseph Campbell, if you think about it. And he goes, who? And I said, wait a minute. You can't have are you fake? I said, is all this an illusion? What do you mean, who? And he goes, no, I honestly don't. I said, man, there's your homework. I'm walking out that door. I'm going home. I'm leaving your house. You need to get some reading done. Yeah, it blew my mind. It was just so funny. Joseph Campbell to me is just an important part of what I do, how I think, and how I live.
Yeah. And I mean, he has the name recognition that some of the other people of that same period that were also doing really interesting work along the same lines maybe don't. I mean, if someone is deeply into shamanism, they might know Mircea Eliade, but if not, you say that to someone and they hand you a tissue and say, bless you. Um, you know, so, and it's one of those names. There's a lot of names that I've come across,
Oh man.
that people just don't want to pronounce. That's one of them. There's a Celticist that is very important. Getting back to philology, that gave me the greatest compliment and the biggest uh, um, what would it be, insult that I've ever had in my life in a single sentence, where I went to talk with him, and when I was working on my dissertation, and I kind of showed him some stuff I had been working on, and I said, I'd love to have hear any advice you have. And he said, well, I don't know why you want to talk with me. I'm not a philologist like you. And he was saying it in this complimentary way, but
Right.
he was someone who had forgotten more about Celtic studies since that morning than I would ever know. He had
Right.
been doing it for like 60 years. Speaking in comic book language, he was one of the greatest Silver Age Celticists there ever was. And his name is Princess Makana. And Princess, incidentally, is just the Irish version of Francis. So, when he grew up, apparently he was Frank McCann, but like many people in Ireland who are Celticists, they rehibernicize their names and go back to the pre-anglicized version. So he became Princess Makana, and really nice guy. And for having said that, he then went on to point something out that was like, this changes everything. This is actually fantastic. If he hadn't said that when I went back to my advisor and told him about it, he was like, I'm embarrassed that I didn't figure that out myself. Yes, of course he's right. And, so yeah, it's an interesting thing, but yeah, I mean, Joseph Campbell, he is dare I say, he's kind of a bottleneck in a certain way of all these different threads that were happening before him, and then so many things that have happened after him. You can't avoid, that neck of the bottle.
No, you can't. No, you absolutely cannot. I wonder how many very talented creators, doesn't matter, right, are out there that have developed something that they've worked on like their whole life.
Mm,
A band's first record is always their best
mm,
because they've worked on that first album their whole life.
right.
Second album, not so good, right? it's a different, but and it's the same thing with all creatives, and so you do your first, and you've dialed it, and then Joseph Campbell comes along, and they rethink, right, and they change that first literary work, and that first movie, that first screenplay, whatever it is. And Joseph Campbell comes along and messes them up, and
Right.
I'm sure it happens more often than it doesn't.
Yeah, and I mean, we're that formulaic thing. I mean, we're losing out on some creativity and some originality as a result. But it's that old adage of, you have to know the rules before you can break them. Um,
Well, okay, but does it is some of it just look is some of it just natural? Like
yeah.
if Homer, right? If Homer read Joseph Campbell, does history change? Right?
Uh, y- I would say definitely yes, because the bits that Joseph Campbell leaves out of his treatment of some of the ancient Greek stuff, there's some real juicy stuff there that is not just, oh, yet another weird Zeus changing into an animal to have sex with some woman's story or
Right.
whatever, but
Right. Right.
some stuff that just has not been paid enough attention to. Um, as one example amongst many, the Persephone myth, right? And the Eleusinian mysteries and all of that. Um, the part that so many people either leave out of their discussion of it or don't take seriously, is the whole part with Demophoon, right? That is the child of the king and queen of Eleusis that Demeter then becomes the nursemaid of. And she doesn't actually suckle him at her breast. She feeds him ambrosia and sticks him in the fire.
Right.
And of course, he ends up dying because the mom comes in and goes, "What's going on here?" Which is repeated then by Plutarch in his discussion of the Isis and Osiris myth. Which direction the influence went is questionable. A lot of people say that it must have come from the Egyptian because it was earlier, but actually
Right.
that version of it is, 2nd century CE with Plutarch. But anyway, um, the thing that people don't realize is the famine and lack of productivity on the earth that results from the whole situation isn't because Demeter was sad that Persephone was gone. It was that she was sad because Demophoon died, and she shut herself up in a temple, and that's when the famine happened.
Right. And
And
that is not Joseph Campbell. So that's the point, though.
yeah,
Right. If Joseph Campbell is around back then, well, okay. So and actually going into what, you know what? I'm gonna go commercial free tonight.
okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
I
that's
was
fine.
going to break for but no, I don't want to stop the flow of this.
Okay.
So that's it.
No
I'm going
worries.
commercial free, and that's it. That's it. Okay. So everybody just got excited. Yay. Or dang, this is my pee time. Sorry.
Right.
Is not every great piece of folklore or mythology ends good. Right. And as a matter of fact, some of the best stuff out there is written to scare the crap out of us, and evil wins. Right.
Yeah.
And which is the opposite of Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
And why is that? Why do we like to get so scared? If you go back to, you just mentioned Osiris, right, and Horus, that's got the baddest, and that's an awful ending. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't get any worse than that. And it's like, but if we look at the indigenous folklore of Central, South, and North America, that stuff is written to scare the crap out, and it's the same thing with the Celtic lore. It's why is that?
One of the things I think about the Celtic stuff is, well, let's be more specific. The Irish stuff in particular, is that if you're a great hero, then one of the distinguishing features of a great hero is they have a great heroic death. And if their death isn't particularly good, then that tells you something about what at least the people responsible for that particular story thought about that hero. So, for example, um, Cuchulain's is one of the longest death tales that there is, and he goes out with a bang. He's dies standing on his feet, tied to a pillar stone, facing the enemy, and they won't actually go up to his body until a crow lands on his shoulder. And then when they go up to him, one of the people that was ultimately responsible for his death uh, cuts his head off to take his head as a trophy. And at that point, Cuchulainn drops his sword and it cuts the guy's hand off. Right. So he's maiming people even after he is dead. You know, that's the great warrior hero of medieval Irish lore. Um, Queen Medivh, who is a very interesting figure in her own right, she, is responsible for the Great Cattle Raid. She's in, ultimately, I think, numerically more stories than Cuchulainn is in. And how does she die? Well, one of her relatives, I believe it's her nephew, is mad at her and throws a wheel of cheese at her when he sees her on the beach, and it kills her. So death by cheese wheel, as opposed to death in battle, because she was a warrior just as much as any of the male heroes were. She was a fighting queen. She was, she kind of did it all, and that's how she ended up dying. So yeah, I mean, I think that the reason that we have these kind of stories in Ireland, is to say that, hey, uh, none of us get out alive, and this is something that's in a lot of myths as opposed to fairy tales. The general uh, scheme that I can't remember who said it now, that I believe it may have even been Freud, if I'm not mistaken, said that, in myths death wins and in fairy tales love wins, right? Eros and Thanatos.
Mhm.
Um, whether you buy that schema or not is another question, but um, I think that there's something very true about that, because you can't just take, um, to use George Lucas terms, you can't just take the light side. There's going to be the dark side, whether you like it or not. And if you don't have a way of dealing with that, or at least conceptualizing it, you're going to have a much harder time. And so, these stories aren't usually just told just to scare people. There's a lesson in it. There's a something about right conduct. There's something about what are the virtues that are being either upheld in this story, or transgressed, right, and
Yeah,
ignored.
but do we? Oh, okay. This is where you lose on the debate team. All
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
In that, sometimes I think that we force ourselves to go in and look at the morals, or look and extract virtue out of a story, because it was never there to begin with, and that we push that in, probably so we can ethically say that our meters are balanced out. but
Right.
but I'm not so sure if virtue is written into everything.
Let,
I don't know.
well, maybe virtue is a bad choice of words.
Well, that's again,
Conduct,
yeah,
right?
conduct.
Because that's often what's being emphasized is, you know, the the right conduct in a situation, and for a particular person of a particular station, is what was emphasized, and the virtues underlie that in theory, right?
Right, right, right.
But so for example, in a lot of the Irish texts, what you find is that people have these geshi or gesh. That's the old Irish pronunciation. The modern Irish is gyas and gyasa. And if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, there is a spell that people always pronounce geese, Geas, but it's actually gyas. And what that is, it's often translated as like a prohibition or a taboo, but really what it is it's something that compels your behavior. Either you have to do something or you have to avoid something. And you get stories of kings, Cormac MacArt, for example, whole big list in the middle of one of the stories of what all of his geshi are. There is a short text that is the geshi of Cuchulainn that just tells all these things that he either was not allowed to do or was allowed or had to do in
Right,
certain
the two
situations.
extremes. Right, the two extremes.
Yeah, and it could be used for either, right?
Right, right, right.
So the way that he was ultimately killed was, the people who were plotting his death got him caught between two of his geshi. He was not allowed to eat dog, right? Because he was named after a dog. Cuchulainn means the Hound of Cullen. We can get more into that later because he's very much a part of the werewolf thing. Um, and But he was also not allowed to refuse an invitation to a feast. And so he was going along the road, and there was a bunch of old women cooking a dog, and they invited him to the feast. And so he stopped because he had to, and they gave him the dog meat, and he didn't eat it. He just stuck it under his thigh, but that made half of his body go paralyzed. And so he was debilitated going into his final, uh, you know, combat, which is ultimately viewed as one of the reasons that he was defeated in that particular situation. If you violate your Geshe in Old Irish, you die.
There's no way you can't go down the middle of the road.
Nope.
Right,
Nope.
right. That's fascinating to me. Two quick questions.
Sure.
I'll do the werewolf 1 second. The first question. Well, actually, no. Let me. Oh man. All right. Let me go this way. The idea in the storytelling of the werewolf is not just Celtic.
No.
You're right. It's not just indigenous American Indians. Man, I just did the most un-PC thing I could possibly say live on the air. Indigenous cultures here in North America, they've been man, they've got the best werewolf stories, and without any that go back way before there was any contact between Europe and North America. Japan, China, right? South America. Does that tell you, were werewolves at one point like a real thing? Was there something, right? Something that caused this to be historical?
Right. I would say yes, they were a real thing, and to a certain extent, they even still are. But it depends on how you understand werewolves. People who physically change, maybe not. I haven't seen it. I haven't experienced it, that type of werewolf. So I don't know for sure. I've read some books where people say, "Oh yeah, I can physically shift and all of this kind of thing," but you know, okay, well then let's see it. But there is. This is one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about a lot of the Celtic examples is that, and particularly Irish examples, is that there is a real life social function or role that is the werewolf. And this exists across the Indo-European languages and cultures, all the way back to the Hittite laws, right? I mean, so it goes back very, very far. And it's similar in all of them. And what it is it's something associated with a youthful age grade that's basically teenagers. There's a lot of people who have tried to make it exclusively male, but in fact, this is one of the reasons that the Irish material is interesting, is because it was equally male and female, or at least had the potential to be. We have records of women engaging in these activities as well.
Does that kind of separate the Celtic version of, I don't want to call it a myth because I think they're real. So
yeah.
But is that what separates the Celtic werewolf from, say, what would be produced in a B movie? Am I saying it right? Am I asking? Yeah, I think you get it.
Yeah, I mean there are some notable examples in films these days. Ginger Snaps is one of my favorites. The first film was excellent. The second, not as good. The third one, interesting. I don't know if there have been more than that, but there some of them are doing interesting stuff with it. But getting back to one of those things we talked about with the perils of Indo-European studies earlier, um, part of the study into this was very much tied up with creating a youthful male warrior cult amongst the Nazis, right? And this was actively encouraged. Particular groups, especially under Himmler, to think of themselves as werewolves, right? You were carrying on this, Indo-Germanische uh, tradition, of being the werewolf and of doing this thing that the men always did. And we have so for example in ancient Greece, the Spartans, they had that ritual called the crypteia, where the young men were turned out and they basically had to survive or they didn't get to be a Spartan, right? um, this existed in many of these cultures, really probably all of them. The Romulus and Remus myth in Roman culture is a remnant of this myth, because after they were raised by the she-wolf and the shepherd found them, how did they live as youths until they founded Rome? Well, they were hunters and raiders, and warriors, and also did a little bit of herding work, which they would have known how to do by that age as well. And then they went on to found Rome, and one brother killed the other.
Hmm.
And there is an Indo-European mytheme that I presented a paper on a number of years ago. Um, in fact, was that just before the pandemic, or the previous year? Anyway, 3 to 4 years ago, that there are strongly canid, wolf or dog identified brothers who end up killing each other. And one of the interesting things about that is one of the versions of it is an Indian version, and where you would expect to find dogs in other Indo-European cultures, oftentimes in India, it'll instead be a monkey. And so the monkey brothers, Sugriv and what is Sugriv's brother's name? Bali or Vali. Um, they uh, they basically do this same thing. They end up killing each other. And there's a lot of these Indo-European mythic elements and mythic micro myths, as Wendy Doniger would call them, that turn up in the Ramayana. Um, and yeah, so they're all over the place there. But yeah, it's a fairly common thing. And my contention is, those particular ones where the characters are not generally turning into wolves. They do in at least one case.
How do
Um,
you, okay.
yep,
So let's stop there for a second.
sure,
Um, we'll continue, but at this point, how does one? I'm going to use the word infected.
sure.
We know that word today.
Yeah.
How does one become infected? I mean, what starts the process? And you can. Is it the same cross culturally with that part of the story around the world?
That is one of the things that varies the most. In a lot of the Irish stories, it's something that comes about by a curse. It doesn't usually come through the bite of another werewolf or a wolf or anything like that, um, in Irish culture for the most part. There's also what we would call constitutional werewolves, where it's just something that some people are born with. Um, and then in others, it's something that they do during this liminal youthful hunter warrior period of their life, and then once they go back to settled society and are a good citizen, they don't do it anymore. And there's a great example of it in the Livonian werewolf trial of Old Theus, that he said that some guy basically passed the thing on to him, and then he passed it on to someone else, and he just doesn't do it anymore. And when the Inquisition was grilling him on all of this and kept saying, oh, you're a servant of the devil, and he goes, no, 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 no. We're on God's side. We're the hounds of God. We were fighting the servants of the devil.
Why? Oh, okay. Why? Why is it? This is one of the most fascinating things. I know my brain works in weird ways. Man's best friend, and I love dogs. I do.
Yes.
I do. I don't watch dog movies because I know the ending and I'm going to cry. So
Yeah.
I don't watch dog movies. But, and we know, right? We're so emotionally attached to dogs.
Yes.
But it's okay to kill a werewolf.
Yeah.
Any way possible. It's like this weird. Is dichotomy the right word? Right? It doesn't make any sense to me. And we're also. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh no, go ahead.
But we're also now forced into, in this PC correct world that we live in. Well, then what makes the wolf? What makes the werewolf upset? Bad childhood? Dad left when he was a kid? Was he beaten as a child? It's like, wait a minute. I don't get it. I'm so confused.
Right. Well, this is one of the things that is interesting about the different Celtic versions, is that there is a lot more heroic werewolves in the Celtic stories across, Brittany, Wales, Ireland, than there are in other cultures, and then there are in modern stuff. Modern things. The werewolf is almost universally evil, almost universally not sympathetic, and should be destroyed. And I think part of that, this is something that in my reading so far, I have never encountered anyone saying this. And I haven't said it myself anywhere. And I kind of thought if I ever do a PhD in Jungian psychology or something, this would be a great dissertation topic, is it's the shadow. It's the shadow projection, that, what better metaphor of the shadow than transforming into this thing that is a total monster, and then everyone else wants to kill you, right? That's the Jungian shadow in a nutshell, really, because it's all about repression and projection. And so that aspect of it, I mean, part of it is this idea that wolves are evil creatures and are vermin and so forth, which we've mostly inherited from Christianity, right?
Yeah. No, I get it. But it's just like, I don't think you can't say that you're a dog lover and then turn around and go watch a werewolf movie and cheer when the werewolf gets shot with a silver bullet. And
Right.
here's the other thing. That's just me. But then there's the other part where we want to, and I think it's incorrect, by the way. I blame Anne Rice. That we want to romanticize, a vampire or a werewolf and something that is killing humans, drinking blood, biting necks out, right? Just going, but yet there's this human side, there's this other side, and there's a romantic twist to this too as well. And I don't dig that. I don't stay dark.
Right.
Stay Celtic in this thing, man.
Well, the interesting thing about that is what I would call the sexual werewolf is a thing that's been around as long as all of this. The first werewolf we have record of in literature is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there, Inanna is saying to Gilgamesh, hey, you don't want to resist me. You don't want to refuse me. We all know what happened to this guy. He refused me, and I turned him into a wolf, and his dogs chased him down and killed him, which is the Actaeon myth, just most of it reversed, right? There, Actaeon was spying on a goddess and got chased down by his own dogs and eaten. Here, he's like, nope, not having anything to do with you, and she made his dogs chase him down. That all comes out of the same, youthful hunter warrior mythos again, right? This kind of the sexy werewolf,
And the sexy vampire, sexy werewolf, all of that, and there is another side of. I mean, it's just like, wait a minute, have you guys forgotten the story?
This is the interesting thing, is that Hittite mention that I referred to earlier. It's in the Hittite laws. And there was this thing that was called, in more recent times, we might refer to it as marriage by capture, marriage by abduction, or as it's called outright in some of the texts, marriage by rape, right? And by rape there, they don't always mean violating the consent of the woman. They mean violating the consent of the family. Right? You didn't get the family's permission. It's an illicit relationship, therefore non-consensual, therefore rape. Right?
Right.
But if you practice this, which was the only way that you could practice marriage if you were in one of these youthful hunter warrior societies, it basically says in the Hittite laws, anyone who practices marriage by capture is an outcast. You have become a wolf. Right?
That's Hittite? Really?
That's Hittite, yeah. So, and you get elements of that elsewhere. I mean, same in the Irish stuff. If you were a member of the Fianna and you were part of that youthful hunter warrior class, you were not allowed to get married. No male female coupling was legally recognized. And so if you ran away with a woman, it would be assumed that it was marriage by rape, basically.
You know what's really strange to me? We can read, and I've done my best to study that. You can read about Hittites in the Bible. Mm-hmm. You can read about sections of their ancient kingdom. You can read about their domination of Israel. You can read about all of it, but we know nothing about the Hittites. It's pretty strange, man. It's in a historical perspective. the Egyptians who got raided, got their country pummeled, right? and they didn't even know who they were.
Right.
And there isn't any explanation in the Egyptian historical record or Israel, or try to go back. It's a strange thing of such a powerful, and like I said, you can read the word Hittite in everybody's in that part of the world.
Yeah.
In their history, but yet we know very, very little.
And part of that is just a public relations problem, because people who study Hittite, there's a lot of surviving texts, and they can tell us a lot about, the laws, about the social customs, things like this. But because there isn't a movie, there isn't a show called The Hittites,
Right. Doesn't exist.
Yeah, and we have said for many years in Celtic Studies, wouldn't it be great if there was the movie, and it ain't Braveheart, that's for sure. Um, Rob Roy is a little bit better in a number of ways, but that's not really Celtic in the proper sense. And there have been some things that have been fairly decent for medieval Irish to various degrees. But yeah, there hasn't been the big epic film of and this is the sad part, is that the major medieval Irish epic, Toin Bo Cúalnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, this has been dying to be made into a film since the 12th century. I mean, it practically, in the existing versions of it that we have, practically tells you where the wide shots and the close-ups are. And it's a great story. It's something that I've wanted to work on for a long time, of writing a screenplay treatment of it, but you'd really have to get like a high budget special effects, Lord of the Rings level to do it justice, because it's a huge battle, with tens of thousands of warriors. There's very little way that we could do it realistically, without CGI and things like that. And then also the crazy things that some of the people do with Cuchulainn. He goes into what they call the Thomas Kinsella translated as the warp spasm, the Riastradd, or the Riastradd rather. It's this battle frenzy where his knees turn backwards and his heart and liver are flapping in his throat, and his head pulls all the way back, and one eye bulges out of his head and the other sinks in, and a shot of blood goes out of his forehead to the height of a ship's mast, and every hair on his head stands up in a spike, so that if you shook the branches of an apple tree above it, not one would fall to the ground. And all of this beautiful discussion, and then he goes on to kill thousands of people in one night, and doing his thunder feats and this feat and that feat, and all of this kind of stuff. And if it wasn't a big Lord of the Rings epic film, an anime version of it would be excellent, because this, if I'm not suggesting that Cuchulainn was the original magical boy transformation, but kind of.
Yeah, you raise such a great point. There's a part of Egyptian history, they get raided by the Hittites. They had never seen the wheel.
Right.
Okay. Right? Never seen the wheel. Egyptians didn't have the wheel. Hittites come rolling in with chariots. Hittites come rolling in with long arrows. Hittites come rolling, right. They got all the high tech stuff, and the Egyptians are running around, wearing animal skins and spears, right? And they get run over.
Yeah.
And it's like the ultimate cineramic movie.
Yeah.
Never been done. I mean, if a culture gets, it's like the first time you see fire, right? You see chariots. Chariots are rolling at you, and your country gets rolled over. That's never been a movie. And who are the Hittites? And yeah, I totally agree. Let me ask you something. I don't want to let this go. I've tried to figure this out. I'm not confident enough in my conclusions. How did King Arthur die? There's so many versions of it, right? So how did he die? Some of it, and it's the opposite of Joseph Campbell, not to go back and go there. But there's some versions of it, he disappears off into the sunset, right? And lives on an island, and there is no ending. And there's others, right? How did King Arthur die?
Yeah,
Was it by a werewolf?
No, but there are werewolves that are Arthurian.
No, there's not. Are there really?
There
Okay,
are.
hold on. We'll come. Let me write that down. I'm not going to let that go.
Yeah.
How did King Arthur die?
Yeah, so the most common version that you find in most of them is, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlin by his bastard son Mordred, by his half sister, and then either in some versions he died and was buried, or put in a cave, or he just kind of retreated to this cave and then will come again when Britain most needs him. But then there's the versions where he is taken to the Isle of Avalon for healing,
Right.
and is presumably still there and just hasn't come back yet, or the Isle of Avalon is no longer accessible because the visitor center at Glastonbury closes at 6 p.m. or whatever. If indeed Glastonbury really is the Isle of Avalon, I have my doubts on that. It fits nicely, and it plays into the ultimate myths of Glastonbury, which a lot of them were just kind of propaganda to get the monastery, pilgrims to come to raise money to restore the monastery. That's where they turned up, the graves of Arthur and Guinevere, for example. That's what that story is about. It's not about myth so much as about the tourist dollars.
So, if you're a betting man, which way do you go?
I would go with the Avalon version because I like it better.
Yeah, me too.
Not to mention that it then does the very convenient thing of a figure who is probably mythic and never really existed in the first place, is that then you don't have the burden of turning up a body and ruining the whole story. I mean, that's a real great story if to deflate any high ideas about somebody. If you go, oh no, he's just buried down the road there. It's and those versions of the Arthur myth are ultimately, there's no other word for it, messianic, right?
Yeah.
Because he'll come again.
Yes.
Well, where have we heard this before? You don't have to be a student of Joseph Campbell to get that. And, Arthur, for all of his good points, is not really very comparable to Jesus, but there you go. He was a rallying point kind of ethnically for the Britons, right? In the face of the Saxon invasions and then eventual takeover. And then the Anglo-Saxons never really kind of domesticated Arthur for themselves. But then the Normans absolutely did. And, that the big boom of Arthurian literature from the 12th century onward is a Normans collaborating with the Welsh phenomenon. Geoffrey of Monmouth and all these guys.
Yeah. I know, and I think it's complicating. I think it's the people that want to debate and be skeptical about everything in life that want to mess up this story. That's what I think, because you don't always need a body. You don't. Do we have Alexander the Great's body?
Nope.
I'm just saying. I'm just bringing Attila the Hun. Anybody got hit?
Alexander the Great's birthday is today, by the way.
Yeah, it is today. No, he never existed. We don't have his body. We don't have his grave. Right? Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? We didn't find King Edward III until 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't always need a body. Yeah. And that's the part with the Arthurian, and they want to say legend, and confusing with legendary. Right? That's I don't think it's fair. I think there's enough there that King Arthur, and on top of that, okay, no, just let me ask you the question. Was King Arthur a real person?
I don't think so.
What? Okay, we're ending the show. I went commercial free for you, Philip.
I know.
I went commercial free. What do you mean King Arthur wasn't real? I don't mess with Santa Claus. If we're going there next, we're going to have some problems.
Well, real in the sense of, did he exist physically, historically? There is not particularly good historical evidence for it. Was there somebody that may have inspired the kernels of the stories of Arthur? Very possibly, but he hasn't made a big enough historical dent, so to speak, to really be readily identifiable. There's that the Scythian hypothesis, that he was this leader of a group of Alans from Scythia that were posted to Roman Britain. That particular theory is very, very thin.
Yeah, that is a thin theory, and there is. Let me say, oh man, you and I, we just need to hang out, because I would just love to just have this conversation all night. This is where I bring in the most valid point that I can make to all of this. When Rome pulled out of Britain, nobody remembered. I'm just going to say a bad word. Nobody remembered Dick. It was done. There was nobody left that knew how to write. Right? There were no scribes. There was no organization. There was no law. There was no order. Everybody was living and making mud pies. It was like it was a bad time. And there's a reason why they call it the Dark Ages. But that didn't stop living.
Yeah.
And so the historical record of everything that was going on in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Great Britain, the entire, it's gone. There isn't, and the religious scholars, of which there were a few left, that were writing in the monasteries, the daily life of the time. That's all we've got, and even that is rarer. And so there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of leaders and heroes that we don't know their names. Yeah. And King Arthur falls into that.
Well, and this is the thing, is that it's very possible that some of that would have been written, but we've just lost it because of just the bad state of the territory at the time, and the Saxon invasions, and then the Viking, raids after that. And during all of that time, the Irish were also raiding Britain. I mean, that's how St. Patrick got to Ireland. He was captured in a slave raid. At least that's what the biography says. St. Patrick may not be a single figure. That's a whole other story. But yeah, there's very little surviving from that time period, and Patrick is one of them. If the letter of Patrick to Coroticus is actually came from the Patrick that we assume it does, then that's a big deal. And that actually plays into werewolves, because in a later Saints' Lives, it said that Patrick turned Coroticus into a fox when he received his letter, because he was a bad guy. And then, as a result of a mistake by Sabine Baring Gould in his book on werewolves from the 1800s, instead of saying Coroticus or Coreticus got turned into a fox, he said Vereticus got turned into a wolf. And this has been repeated endlessly on the internet, but also in a number of important publications in the 20th century ever since. And, before that, this did not exist. St. Patrick turning people into wolves. There are other saints who turn people into wolves in Ireland. It wasn't unusual. But and in fact, there is a 12th century story from Gerald of Wales that said that as a result of a curse, this particular population, a male and a female of them, were werewolves, for a number of years. But in the earlier versions of it, it's an Irish saint. Gerald of Wales probably picked Patrick because he was more well known internationally. But yeah, that's it's one of these things where that stuff probably did exist. It just hasn't survived. The things that we know existed, there's a really important manuscript called the Book of Drum. Well, in English, we would say the Book of Drum Snat, but the Irish title is a little nicer, Keen Drumma Schnechta. And there was a monastery at this place called Drumschnechta, which is the ridge of snow, and then that became anglicized as Drumsnat. And it was presumably compiled there first. We know a number of the stories that were in it, or at least versions of them, and it survived up till the 17th century, and then it disappears. And we know not what happened to it since then. And it was close. I mean, that's only a couple hundred years, and that was an 8th century manuscript that maybe had material in it from earlier.
I've always felt, it's okay to laugh, I've always felt that the Monty Python version of King Arthur was the most accurate.
Yes, I agree.
Oh, you do? Good.
Yeah.
I learned more from that than I did in 12 years of school.
Yeah. Well, the part that is actually the most accurate is the part that most people hate now, which is the end. It just stops, right? And there's a number of the great Arthurian stories that just stop.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the page is missing in the manuscript, and the part with the you know darn this blasted weather thing, when the one of the animated scribes is copying, and then you know he kind of scribbles and goes out and has a word with the sun and the clouds. um yeah, that kind of thing happens. And or part of a manuscript gets separated, and then it gets combined into another manuscript, and just this story on this page stops, and then something else picks up over here you know
So
so
funny, so
yeah.
funny, so funny. Yeah, that's how it went. Now, what? Okay, so I get the St. Patrick. I have not paid attention to the chat tonight. I'm so focused on this conversation. But somebody wrote. I don't want to scroll back. I just happened to glance over and it said St. Patrick wasn't a saint. His dad was a Roman emperor, and they killed everybody that wasn't Catholic. Right?
Well, we don't actually know that much about his family, and depending on who you ask, if a saint is who the Catholic Church has canonized, he was not canonized as that process existed since the 12th century or so. Any saints before that were not, and Ireland had thousands of saints, um, and hundreds of saints with the same names or variations of the names. So, oh, well, you've got a Saint Bridget. Well, our town has a Saint Bridget now too. Oh, you've got a Saint, Bara. Okay, well, we're going to have a Saint Finbar, etc. And different versions of Patrick, different versions of Columba. So, Saint Columba or Columbkilla, the saint that's the patron saint of Kilkenny, which is very important for werewolves, because that's where one of the main werewolf families was based. The patron saint of Kilkenny is Canis, and that's just like a pet form of Columba.
We didn't. We didn't talk about Dogman.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Well,
jeez, I cannot believe. And I've got all these other things here that I wanted to get in tonight. From the very beginning of the show, and I got some email as well,
yep.
which was, Jimmy, I've never heard of a Dogman. And I thought we were going to spend about 90 minutes on Dogman, and we've only got a few minutes left.
Sure.
Let's start with definition.
Okay, so the easiest, Dogman or dog head, right? Is it's literally a human body with a dog's head. So the most popular version would be Anubis, right, from Egyptian. He's a dog head. And people go, well, no, it's actually a jackal. Well, there's every evidence to indicate it was an Egyptian golden wolf, not a jackal, in the case of Anubis. The other one that everybody knows, probably more people even know than Anubis, is Goofy, right? Why is Pluto a pet, but Goofy is a character that interacts with Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse? It's because he's a dog head.
I never thought of that.
Yeah. It was great to present that to the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies in 2003.
That got you a full boat, right?
Yeah.
Well,
you had to. I had to do it right. I said Anubis is the most commonly recognized dog-headed figure, with the possible exception of Disney's Goofy. And you have to say it slightly, with contempt, and then you get the laugh. But anyway,
right.
I think it's hilarious, because that's been something that a lot of comedians have said, of why is Goofy in a dog collar and running around barking and stuff, but or rather Pluto, but then Goofy is wearing clothes and throwing magic beans and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's why it's this. And there's a lot of confusion because the Hollywood werewolf and the television werewolf is really a dog head or a wolf head, not really a werewolf. In the most of the pre-modern stories, when they say that someone is a werewolf, they're a human who turns into a wolf, an actual wolf. And it might be a big wolf, it might be a particularly ferocious wolf, but that's literally what werewolf means, right? In every language that it exists in. Were is man in Anglo-Saxon, and then wolf. In Greek, lycanthropos, right? Logos or lycos is wolf. Anthropos is human.
Lycus, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it goes right across the range of the different cultures. So it's actually a dog head. And one of the interesting things about this is we've got tons of them in Irish in particular. There's a couple in Welsh. The name exists as a personal name in ancient Gaulish. So yeah, it's something that's there, and I think probably in origin it comes from the same place that I'm suggesting werewolves do, which is that youthful hunter warrior society. And then just the metaphor gets literalized eventually. And there was probably no small number of young men wearing a wolf skin cap that's the head of a wolf on their head. I mean, that's what Hades, uh, had the wolf skin cap that turned him invisible. And that may be Anubis. The embalming priests probably had a mask that they put on while they were doing their job that looked like what we think of as a jackal, but was probably an Egyptian wolf. So yeah, these and then it gets generalized or thought to be a race, and that happened as of late Greek and Roman stuff. Pliny the Elder, writing about the monstrous races, kynocephali are a part of it,
Right.
and continued
right.
to be forever,
That's
throughout
right.
the medieval period.
You know what? First off, before we run out of time, I've got to thank you for one of the best conversations I've had in a long time on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah,
But
this has been great. I loved
yeah,
it.
it's totally awesome. But I often wonder that especially when you look at the gods, the ancient gods, the demigods of Egypt, that's a great example of that. But they weren't the only culture in the world to combine humans with animal figures. Yeah. And I'm not so sure if we just chalk it up to imagination or representation. It's a crocodile because it's Anubis, it's a doghead because that maybe there was access to an interdimensional situation where this was what was witnessed. Right. That's all that I'm. There's too much of the fantastical is not the right word because it's not fantastic. We're not fans. But there's a word there that I'm trying to reach for, that you see it for an instant, you witness it, and you have the experience, and then you lock it down into history with images, with sculpture and everything else. But it was just a glimpse of that reality, because that's what physics is trying to tell us today. Right? I'm just not so sure that maybe Anubis was real.
Yeah, well, and the fact that they talk about a dog-headed race, they talk about the land of the Dogheads, all of this kind of stuff, which, sometimes they try to locate it geographically, but realistically, there was never, some of the other monstrous races, there's some reason to believe that, the Blemier, for example, who didn't have heads and had faces in their chests, that may have been particular African tribes that had big faces painted on their shields, and that's all you saw was, arms, legs, and this big shield with a face on it. But yeah, I mean, certainly with some of my own experiences, I saw dog heads in certain the spiritual encounters that I had before I even knew what they were beyond Anubis. So yeah, it's very possible. I don't. Yeah, all of these things. There's. I think there's reasons for them. I think that the details that people got, and the fact that so many dog-headed beings are associated with death and the afterlife. You've got Anubis. You've also got in Aztec society Zolotl.
That's right. That's right.
Which is not, not a one-to-one correlation, but
pretty close.
Yeah,
pretty close. Definitely dealing with the underworld.
Yes, and and then you've got Hades with his wolfskin cap, and some of the Etruscan deities, seem to be dog-headed or wolf-headed as well, that are associated with death. So they may have been tapping into something that, this is just one of the features of one of these, other realities, or one of these interstitial realities, these between spaces where the beings you encounter are not exactly one thing or another. They're a mix.
Yeah, they're both. They're both. And yeah. I have zero issue with that.
Yeah,
I really do. And we do have to wrap and say goodnight, but I'll close with this idea. Ayahuasca.
Right.
Okay. I'm just saying there is access to another world, another dimension, call it parallel, meta. It doesn't matter we don't understand it, but the experiences that go back a couple of thousand years, to today, the experiences are too similar. Right. And I don't think it's a dreamscape. I don't think it's in the mind. I think that we are accessing that. And who's to say that the ancients weren't doing the very same thing? And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Phillip, fantastic show. Where can everybody reach out to you?
So let's see. The easiest ways would probably be my academia.edu page. So just look up my name, and be careful, because there's somebody else with my exact name, apparently, who's some kind of biologist. But if you see Celtic and werewolf stuff, that's me. And then also my my spiritual website, Sufenas Virius Lupus .wordpress.com, I believe.
And we've got the links up. We've got the links up for both. So fantastic conversation tonight. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Be safe and be well. I look forward to the next time you're on the show.
I look forward to it as well. That would be great.
We left so much on the table tonight. Thank you so much, Phillip.
Thank you.
Show. Thank you. Perfect show tonight. And for me, as everybody knows, thank you, Phillip. Everybody knows this is my Friday. So everybody have a great, safe, fun, and amazing weekend. I got a lot of work to do, and I've got to work this weekend, but you guys have fun. Fade to Black is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee Newman, and Michelle Freed. Thank you to Dennis and Kevin. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and this broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2023 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network, Inc. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. I'll see everybody on Monday. Until then, be safe. Go back, Lee Tappy.